남김없이 한평생 나가자도 뜨거운 맹세.
What you just heard is Marching for Our Beloved, a song written in the 1980s for the funeral of Yong Sang-won, an activist who died on May 18, 1980. Today, it is sung by thousands around South Korea on that same day, May 18th. Why is that song so important? The reason that song is sung every May 18th in South Korea is that Yong Sang-won was not the only person who died that day. On May 18th, 1980, approximately 600 citizens of Gwangju, a city in the south of the country, were killed by government troops. The assassination of President Park Chung-hee on the 26th of October in 1979 left a power vacuum in the nation, one that was swiftly filled by South Korean Army General Chun Doo-hwan, who instituted a military rule over the country. South Korea was under martial law. The following months saw the kindling of a democratic uprising, particularly amongst university students in the country. Student unions sparked protests, which grew month by month in scale, from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands to the 100,000 students who protested martial law outside Seoul Station on May 15, 1980. The fire was well and truly blazing across the nation. Cheonam University in Gwangju was a particularly vocal participant in the protests, with the students of Gwangju uniting in great vocality over the early months of 1980. The military government needed to make a decision: accept their inability to sustain a rule over the country, or silence the voices of dissent. On May 18, 1980, in Gwangju, they chose the latter. At 10 a.m., a few hundred students gathered outside Cheonam's front gates. Fiery clashes between students and military led to stones being thrown by protesters. The exchange made its way to the downtown area where the protests swelled. Soon, thousands shouted in the streets. At 4 p.m., as tensions showed no signs of subsiding, 686 new soldiers arrived from the 33rd and 35th Battalions of the 7th Airborne Brigade. The first casualty was Kim Gyong-chol, a 29-year-old deaf man walking past the protest who was beaten to death by a soldier. Sadly, he was not the last. The following few hours saw the military open fire on the protesters, unleashing rounds of bullets into the bodies of students, parents, and children. As night set in, the streets were lined with the bleeding bodies of democratic citizens, mercilessly slaughtered by their own government. And with that came international outrage. Or did it? The military government realized that they had to keep what was happening in Gwangju quiet. And so, they executed what author Sheena Choi called a three-pronged strategy. They cut off Gwangju from the outside world, tightly controlled the media, and severely punished citizens who dared speak out about the events. They did report on what happened that day, but their report contained the following information. On May 18th, in Gwangju, 144 people were killed, 127 of them civilians, as a result of a student uprising. Let's unpack this for a moment. First, the numbers. 127 civilian deaths. Reports from those in Gwangju at the time placed the death toll anywhere from 500 to over 1,000. George Katsiafikis, professor of humanities and social sciences at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, Massachusetts, and a leading figure in investigating and re-evaluating the events of May 18th, describes how, and I quote, "The military burned an unknown number of corpses, dumped others into unmarked graves, and destroyed its own records. Both in the report and in the physical, deaths were made to vanish." The second piece of this report that is so crucial is the placement of agency. Instead of describing May 18th as a military attack on the citizens, the impetus for agency is laid upon the citizens through the word uprising. This single word shifts the blame from the government to the people and frames the government as the defensive party. Even today, the events of May 18th are referenced under different names. The Gwangju Uprising, the Gwangju Massacre, the Gwangju Democratic Movement. Each of these names shapes our notion of responsibility, and with repeated use over decades, shapes the way we think about the past. The language we use both constructs and is constructed by our perception. To hammer this point home with as much significance as possible, consider this. One of the most important personal accounts of what happened in Gwangju, a book by the name of Gwangju Diary, Beyond Death, Beyond the Darkness of the Age, by Lee Jae-woo, which was published 6 years after the massacre, was confiscated and its publisher and suspected author arrested. With this act, the government literally removed the language of the silenced from the discourse, leaving one narrative to dominate the rest. The telling of history doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is intertwined with political, social, and economic intentions. Starting to untangle that mess is a necessary and vital historical process. The way the Gwangju Uprising, or Massacre, or democratization movement has been told and retold in history indicates the malleability of historical truth. Let's step back for a moment. Had you heard of the Gwangju Massacre before? My guess, based on the many conversations I've had over the last few weeks, where my friends and family have expressed disbelief over my recounting of May 18th, is that you hadn't. It seems news of Gwangju never made it to the West. I wasn't content with that, and so I did some more digging. What I found blew my mind. Let me read you a little part of the minutes of a meeting that took place at the White House on May 22nd, 1980. Here it is. The first priority is the restoration of order in Gwangju by the Korean authorities with the minimum use of force necessary. The US leadership knew about the massacre that took place a few days earlier, and yet still authorized the consequent use of force against protesters in Gwangju. For the US, that was an economic imperative for social stability in South Korea, and this social stability was being adamantly compromised by the students in Gwangju. And there's more. One of the key individuals at that meeting, and in correspondence with the US Embassy in Seoul at the time, was a man by the name of Richard Holbrooke. George Katsiafikis explains in his notes, Holbrooke promised the Korean government that the US would not publicly contest their version of whatever events transpired. Richard Holbrooke is no insignificant figure. He served as a US ambassador to the United Nations between 1993 and 1994, was Assistant Secretary of State twice, and was the Special Advisor on Afghanistan and Pakistan for the Obama administration. He is a widely celebrated US diplomat who served a long and revered career for the US government. Now, I'm not trying to make a claim against the moral integrity of Richard Holbrooke, though one could be made. My point is that there was and is distinct reasons for the US to not publicize their involvement in the Gwangju Massacre. The politics of the past, as well as the politics of the present, benefit from being divorced from those events. Throughout all of this research and all of the conversations I had about Gwangju, I became increasingly impassioned. I felt I had to do something more. And so I did. I went to Gwangju. I bought a bus ticket from Seoul Central Terminal to Gwangju bus station and ended up arriving in the city late on a Monday night as the snow began to fall.
So it's 7:15 p.m. and I have arrived in Gwangju. It's currently snowing and bloody freezing.
The next day, I headed to the outskirts of the city to spend a morning in the May 18th National Cemetery, the site of 775 graves of people linked to the events of Gwangju in some way. Upon arrival, I found myself alone.
There's absolutely no one here. I haven't seen a single person since I got off the bus. It's incredibly quiet and very peaceful.
As I made my way along the rows of graves, stopping by each photograph, a voice greeted me. 안녕하세요. An immaculately dressed older gentleman had joined me in the cemetery. I walked over to him, and a few sentences later, we realized we spoke no mutual language. I thought this would be the end of our interaction, but it was not. He motioned for me to walk with him, and so I followed. Our feet stopped in front of a grave in the back left corner of the cemetery. Waipu, he said. He had taken me to see his wife's grave. Over the next 20 minutes, this man spoke to me as tears crawled down his cheeks. We shared the small cakes he had brought to rest upon his wife's grave. He spoke, and he spoke, and he spoke, and heartbreakingly, I couldn't understand what he said. I feared I had lost this conversation to the limits of language. After he departed, however, I noticed that my phone didn't have a black screen. You see, just before I was approached by this man, I was recording an audio message to myself, reflecting on how I was feeling walking amongst the graves. I never turned that recording off. To my surprise and delight and fear, I had recorded my conversation with this man. Here is what he told me. I was arrested after a long time of being wanted by the police during the Gwangju democratic movement. After being put in the jail for 2 years, I was tortured for a while and released. He then went on to speak of the inaccuracies of the government's reporting of the events of May 18th. About 3,000 people were killed by government's attack. Towards the end of the conversation, he expressed his belief in the eventual reversing of the silenced. History can't be hidden, but the government is still trying to hide the fact of the movement. Now, I'm not saying that this man is speaking historical truth, but his suffering, the pain this event caused him and his family, that is true. That is real. That is a silence begging to be heard. He told me these things knowing that I couldn't understand him. If that isn't a voice craving a listener, I don't know what is. Returning from Gwangju has been a process of disentangling myself from the pain and destruction of the events of May 18th. I found myself frustrated. How can I possibly take everything I've learned and am learning and make something that does any kind of justice? Trying to figure that out has driven me to the core of why Gwangju matters and why it is so much more than the events of that day. It matters because it demonstrates how the narrative of truth is but one of many narratives, all of which are entangled in bias and distortion and a subjective lens. The story that is commonly held to be true is not the story which is most accurate, but the story that is disseminated by the most powerful. The voice of a man who lost his wife tragically exists within a system that dictates the dominant narrative, and thus the hegemonic narrative. The one that protects those in power is the one that drowns out such a voice. Remember that song from the start of this podcast, Marching for Our Beloved? There is a line in that song that says more than I ever could. The line translates from Korean to English as, "The river and the mountain remembers, despite the passing of years." The river and the mountain remembers, despite the passing of years. What happened on May 18th, 1980, in the South Korean city of Gwangju may be missing from history books, and twisted and molded into something so far from the truth that it no longer even resembles any part of the truth. But it does exist somewhere. It lives on in the river and the mountain which give life to those who lived through it. It is their voices which are heard only by the wind. And it's our job, the job of historians and critical thinkers and humanitarian citizens of the world, to acknowledge that these voices exist and pay attention to them as the wind floats past our ears.